On to some of the roles that divide the early and late stages. And here, clinical investigator, this is going to be a key role that we're going to come back to as really a source for potential conflicts. Here, the clinical investigator could be an actual principal investigator, or they could be just designing trials for a company. And then another key role, a board advisor, sitting on the advisory board, often paid in fees for their services. To the later stage roles, this is, again, we're defining later stage as post-approval when device is being commercialized. The three kind of big buckets that we identified as educator, the physicians are now educating their peers, either at conferences or through talks, about the device and about the new technologies. Often physicians participate in panels, and we've broken these into kind of three categories. An advisory panel, which is looking more at the strategy of the company, as opposed to a product development panel, for example, that's helping guide the actual development of a particular device. And then finally, consultants, which may have overlap with the panels as well. And here we found, forms of, general consultants or, consultants for a standalone project or one-off activity. Okay, and moving on to the types and determinants of compensation. Through this research, we've identified 4 basic categories that have defined most of this compensation. The first is cash and fees, the second being consulting arrangements. The distinction here is cash and fees are often payments such as an honorarium that don't exist absent of a formal contract, while a consulting arrangement is fees either for long periods of times or distinct periods of time, but with a contract in place. And these are opposed to equity or royalty payments, where equity is actually owning stock in a company and royalty as some percentage of commercial sales. And we're going to look into, this is kind of setting the table for how these different forms of payment affect the relationship and potential conflict of interest. In terms of setting the appropriate level of compensation for physicians, we looked to Warren Watson, a former executive from Medtronic, and asked what Medtronic's plan is moving forward. And he outlined a 3-step plan that they are using. The first is probably the most critical step is ensuring that there's a direct link between the compensation and the services rendered. This removes a lot of ambiguity. It improves the perception of the payments. It makes it clear the payments are for a specific service. Number 2 and 3 have to do more with setting the level of compensation. Their recommendations, are they focusing on the opportunity cost of the physician's time, what they would be receiving elsewhere in their practice or from other companies, industry partners, and this helps set a more appropriate level for the compensation. And these 4 various compensation categories we see throughout all stages of company formation. Typically there's more equity and royalties in the early stage, the cash-strapped startups, and more of the consulting and cash payments in the later stages. And on to the most controversial aspect of the research, the potentials for conflict of interest. We found 4 primary areas of conflict. We're going to focus mostly on on 2 through 4. The first is disputes over who actually owns the IP for a co-developed product, which is an interesting area, but something that we are not really focusing on. 2 through 4, the questions about physicians may be more likely to use a product when they have either an existing relationship or receive large royalties from the company. And then number 4, the physicians who have stake in a company and are asked to serve as clinical investigators and what role that plays in potentially biasing the results as clinical investigators. And we're focusing on 2 through 4, as I said, in part because these were highlighted as motivators behind the physician payment sunshine provision. And because it's business school, we had to sneak a 2x2 matrix in there at some point, so we did here. But here we think it really lays out the potential major areas for conflict and areas that are somewhat minor. And this is largely determined by the type of compensation paired with what role the physician is playing within the company at the time. So if we look at the top left, we're talking about cash payments or consulting arrangements for physicians that are using a product in their daily practice. So here, these cash payments have a tendency or have the potential to look like kickbacks if a physician is using a certain amount of product and then being paid immediately thereafter for their support of the company. And so that has a potential for inducement for a physician to be encouraged to prescribe certain drugs or certain devices for a situation, as opposed to that same physician who is receiving equity or small royalty from that company. That physician is unlikely, the actions of one physician in their prescribing behavior is unlikely to affect the value of the equity of a company. On the other hand, when we talk about clinical investigators, here a physician paid in equity, now all of a sudden the physician's role in the clinical trial may have large impact on the value of that equity, depending on the results of the study. So there's a potential for scientific bias there, whereas being paid set fees for the work on a clinical trial is potentially less of an inducement. So conflicts will always be there, but the key distinction from our research was how they're handled. The first piece of advice that we heard was the ability to separate the physician's role in the company creation and growth from involvement in the later clinical trials. Number two was tightly linking compensation to services rendered. This was repeated again and again throughout our research, specifically as an end to retainers, as an end to payments for just being a friend of the company. It's also important to know that industry self-regulation is huge, and AdvaMed is kind of leading the way there to promote transparency, and this is obviously going to be more and more important and may help stave off some future regulations. And then the other side of the street, physician self-regulation is also critical through training, through mentors, and senior and peer review. Onto the sunshine provision, what actual changes are going to be instituted. The new provision will require companies, manufacturers to report any payments defined very broadly, payments, gifts, any transfer of money, so anything more than $10 will have to be reported. This provision won't preempt more strict state laws. So anyone from Massachusetts or New Hampshire knows that the laws currently on the books there are more strict than this, and those will continue. So the rules are going to continue to vary from state to state. There is an exemption for new products in clinical trials, so there's some sense you can remain confidential for up to 4 years from the payment or until the FDA approves a device. And then these reports are going to be published annually on a searchable public website. And the implications are that companies are going to have to take a serious look at the role physicians play one by one, each physician. The companies are going to have to spend more money and time reviewing and tracking these payments. This may serve as another motivation for companies to do their clinical work or other work outside of the country. And this impact is going to be felt by both major players and startups low on cash. So to wrap up, there are some limitations to our research. Our blind spot is that we are very heavily focused in our interviews and our research on the early stage and in cardiology, in part because that's who's around us in the Bay Area. So our plan is to continue to do interviews in other therapeutic areas, specifically orthopedics, and with other members of the value chain. In addition, we have an ongoing detailed analysis of venture-backed startups to look and see if there is any quantifiable data to support the value of physicians in early stage companies, what value they bring to the commercialization and success of the company. And to conclude, the clinician-company collaborations are clearly vital to the innovation process. But with that said, they are subject to conflict of interest, especially along 2 dimensions. The first in the pre-approval stage during clinical trials, and the second in the post-approval stage as a physician is practicing and is getting paid for services from the company. Increasing scrutiny is going to raise the cost of doing business in the U.S., may encourage some more business or some more efforts to be focused outside the country. And lastly, the industry self-regulation can and must start playing a bigger role in this process, because if not, it's becoming more and more clear that regulation from the state and federal level is going to come in and may eventually prohibit relationships of all types with physicians, and that is not good for the companies and is also not good for patient care.